3 words changed everything for the most feared man in the city. Leave me alone. Ariel Rose said it with such conviction, such absolute refusal to bend, that Jackson Reed felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Genuine obsession laced with something that terrified him even more than his enemies. What he didn't know was that his interest in her had just painted a target on her back, and the rival, watching from the shadows, was already planning how to use this woman to bring the Reed empire to its knees. The low hum of conversation mixed with the soft clink of crystal glasses. Ambient light glowed warm against dark wood and leather. And Jackson Reed was supposed to be reviewing the final acquisition documents, not watching a woman in a sapphire blue dress who looked like she wanted nothing to do with his world. But that was before she took the seat at the bar. From his private corner booth on the elevated section of the casino lounge, he had a clear view of the entire floor. The blackjack tables, the roulette wheels, the cocktail servers gliding between high rollers with practiced smiles. He was there to sign off on a property merger, for the signatures and handshakes that would extend his family's reach across 3 new territories. The deal represented months of careful negotiation, strategic maneuvering, and the kind of patient calculation that had built his empire from the ground up. By midnight, he would control shipping routes from Boston to Miami, legitimate fronts that would launder millions while appearing pristine on paper. Instead, his attention fixed on one woman sitting alone at the marble bar. She wore a sapphire blue dress that draped elegantly over her shoulders, the fabric catching the amber light every time she shifted her weight. Dark hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders, and even from this distance, Jackson could see the set of her jaw, the way she held herself with quiet, deliberate composure. She lifted a glass of what looked like whiskey, took a small sip, and set it down with precision, her gaze sweeping the room once before returning to the middle distance. There was something about the way she occupied space, not apologetic, not seeking attention, just existing with complete self-possession in a room designed to make people feel small unless they had money or power. Jackson lost the thread of Dean's presentation entirely. "Boss," his lieutenant said, tapping the contract with one finger. "The final clause needs your approval." Jackson blinked once, then dragged his gaze back to Dean's expectant face. "Repeat that," he said. He couldn't explain why, but danger was closing in. Dean's eyes flicked toward the bar for a fraction of a second, registering the woman in blue, but he was smart enough not to comment. He returned to the numbers, the split of revenue streams, the timeline for integration. Jackson listened, gave a few clipped responses, and signed the documents in less than 8 minutes. His signature was bold, decisive, the mark of a man who'd signed 1,000 contracts and never second-guessed a single one. It was efficient, decisive, the way he preferred it. But his mind kept drifting back to the bar. When the meeting concluded, the property developer shook his hand with careful deference and left with his attorney in tow. The man's palm had been damp with nervous sweat, the way it always was when people did business with Jackson Reed. They wanted his money, his connections, his protection, but they also understood the implicit danger of disappointing him. Dean remained, watching as his boss leaned back in the booth, dark eyes locked on the same spot across the lounge. "Want me to run a background check?" Dean asked quietly. Jackson didn't answer immediately. He watched as the woman turned slightly on her stool, enough to scan the entrance, then returned her attention to her drink. Her posture was controlled, aware. When a casino patron in an expensive suit stepped too close to her space, she angled her body away, creating distance without making a scene. A server approached to offer a refill, and she shook her head politely, covering the top of her glass with her hand. The gesture was practiced, protective. She'd been in enough bars to know how quickly a moment of inattention could turn dangerous. She was careful, guarded, not performing for anyone. Jackson felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. curiosity laced with something sharper, something almost like recognition. He'd spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Loyalty bought with fear, affection traded for security, respect won through violence. This woman sat alone in his casino, drinking his whiskey, and radiated the kind of self-sufficiency that suggested she didn't need anything from anyone. What he didn't know was that someone was watching. "Who is she?" he murmured. Dean heard it anyway. "I can find out in 10 minutes. Jackson straightened, adjusting the cuffs of his charcoal suit jacket. The fabric was Italian, custom-tailored, worth more than most people earned in a month. Everything he wore was armor, carefully chosen to project power and control. "No," he said. "Not yet." He left the booth and descended the 3 shallow steps that separated the VIP section from the main floor. People moved out of his path without conscious thought. It wasn't just the tailored suit or the broad shoulders that cut an imposing silhouette. It was the way Jackson Reed moved through a space like he owned every square inch of floor beneath him. Because he did. This casino, this building, half the legitimate businesses in a 10-block radius, all of it bore his name or the names of carefully constructed shell corporations that led back to him. He crossed the lounge, ignoring the glances, the women who straightened in their seats as he passed, the dealers who nodded in silent acknowledgement. His focus narrowed to a single point. The ambient noise of the casino, slot machines chiming, dice rattling, cards shuffling, faded into background static. All he could see was sapphire silk and the elegant line of her neck as she tilted her head to take another sip. She didn't see him coming. Not at first. If a story about someone finding power in refusing to bend, about a woman who told the most dangerous man in the city to leave her alone and changed his entire world, if that resonates with you, go ahead and subscribe. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We're building a family of people who refuse to shrink for anyone. He stopped 2 feet from her left side, close enough to be noticed, far enough to respect the boundaries she'd clearly established. Up close, she was even more striking. Warm brown skin caught the golden glow of the pendant lights above the bar, subtle highlights on her cheekbones suggesting she'd dressed with care but not vanity. Dark eyes framed by long lashes, lips painted a deep wine that matched the controlled confidence in the line of her shoulders. She wore minimal jewelry, small diamond studs, no rings, a delicate silver bracelet that looked like it carried sentimental rather than monetary value. Jackson waited for the right beat, the moment when the bartender moved to serve another guest, when her attention was untethered for just a second. He'd learned patience in his line of work. Timing was everything. In negotiations, in violence, in the careful dance of power that governed his world. Then he stepped closer. She turned, and their eyes met for the first time. One wrong move, and everything would fall apart. There was no instant recognition in her gaze, no softening. She looked at him the way she might look at any man who had invaded her carefully maintained space. Neutral, assessing, unimpressed. Most people, when they met Jackson's eyes, showed some flicker of awareness, recognition of his face from newspaper photos, or if not that, then instinctive understanding that he was someone who mattered, someone dangerous. She showed none of that. Just a woman interrupted by an unwelcome intrusion. "Good evening," he said, his voice low, controlled. Her brows lifted slightly. "Evening." The word was polite but carried no warmth, no invitation to continue. "Jackson Reed," he said, offering his hand. "I own this place, and I noticed you looked like the only person here who actually wanted to be left alone." It was direct, not a line he'd rehearsed, just the truth as he saw it. Jackson had never needed pickup lines. Women gravitated toward him for his power, his money, the dangerous edge that made them feel alive. But standing before this woman, he found himself hoping she wouldn't see him that way. He wanted her to see something else, though he couldn't have articulated what. She tilted her head, as if surprised he'd noticed that instead of leading with a compliment about her appearance. "I am," she said simply. Her voice was warm but carried no invitation. She didn't take his hand. Jackson lowered it, unbothered. The rejection didn't sting. It intrigued him. "Can I buy you another drink? Or at least keep you company while you finish that one?" She shifted on the stool, the sapphire fabric catching burgundy and gold from the overhead fixtures. She set her glass down deliberately, angled her body slightly away from him, and met his gaze with unflinching directness. "I'm here to be left alone," she said. Her tone wasn't rude, just final, the kind of boundary that brooked no negotiation. Jackson leaned in slightly, instinct pushing him to press just a little, to see if her boundary would bend. In his world, everything was negotiable. Every person had a price, a pressure point, a place where their resolve crumbled. "I don't usually hear no in my own casino." Her eyes went cold. She didn't flinch, didn't lean back. Instead, she held his gaze and spoke with quiet, lethal precision. What she said next shattered his trust instantly. "I warned you, Mr. Reed. Leave me alone." The lounge seemed to contract around them. Conversations at nearby tables continued, oblivious, but in the small bubble of space between Jackson and this woman, the air turned electric with tension. No one had ever spoken to Jackson Reed like that. Certainly not in his own territory. Not with that level of absolute conviction. He expected to feel anger, the familiar surge of control being challenged, the hot rush of fury that preceded violence in his world. Instead, something far more dangerous ignited in his chest. Obsession. For the first time, he wasn't in control. He straightened slowly, studying her face for any sign of fear or performance. There was none. Just steel wrapped in sapphire silk, a woman who had drawn a line and meant it. Her hands weren't trembling. Her breathing stayed even. She wasn't posturing, wasn't testing him to see how far she could push. She simply wanted him gone, and she'd stated it with the kind of clarity that most people in his world had forgotten how to access. "Understood," he said quietly, then stepped back. But as he returned to his booth, as Dean looked up with a question already forming, Jackson knew with absolute certainty that this refusal, delivered with fire and zero fear, had just driven him completely, irrevocably wild. This choice would define the rest of his life. The file landed on Jackson's desk at 2 a.m. Dean had worked fast, assembling a dossier that would have impressed a federal investigator. Ariel Rose, 28. Independent art consultant specializing in contemporary acquisitions for private collectors. No criminal record, no debts, no messy entanglements. She lived alone in a converted loft in the Arts District, drove a 5-year-old sedan she'd paid off in cash, and volunteered twice a month at a youth literacy program. Jackson read every page 3 times. There was one detail everyone missed. He sat in his office with the city sprawled dark below him, nursing scotch that had gone warm in his hand, and tried to understand why this woman had crawled under his skin like a splinter he couldn't extract. The office was quiet at this hour, just the low hum of the climate control and the distant sounds of traffic 40 floors below. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city he controlled, not officially, not on any legal document, but in the ways that mattered. The politicians he owned, the businesses that paid tribute, the police who looked the other way. He'd been refused before, certainly, but those refusals came with calculation, with the performative hesitation of someone testing their value. Women who said no, while their eyes said yes, playing a game they thought he wanted. Ariel's rejection had been different. Final. Honest. She hadn't been testing boundaries or fishing for reassurance. She'd simply wanted him to leave her alone, and she'd meant it with every fiber of her being. Leave me alone. 3 words delivered without malice, without theatrics. Just the unshakable conviction of someone who knew exactly what she wanted and refused to compromise. Jackson replayed the moment in his mind, the cold fire in her eyes, the absolute absence of fear. In his world, everyone bent. His lieutenants, his rivals, the politicians on his payroll, the women who gravitated toward power like moths to a flame. They all adjusted themselves to fit his gravity, reshaping their desires and principles to accommodate his presence. She hadn't moved an inch. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for family. He wanted that, craved it with an intensity that bordered on irrational. Not her fear, not her compliance, but that spine of steel wrapped in sapphire silk. He wanted to know what it felt like to stand next to someone who wouldn't fold, who wouldn't reshape themselves to please him, who would tell him the truth even when the truth was no. For the first time in years, Jackson felt the stirring of something that wasn't hunger for power or control. It felt almost like loneliness, the recognition that he'd surrounded himself with people who would never challenge him, and had somehow become untethered from genuine human connection in the process. The dossier told him facts: where she lived, what she did for work, how she spent her time, but it couldn't tell him what he really wanted to know. What made her capable of looking a man like him in the eye and drawing a line? What gave her the strength to refuse someone who held the kind of power that made senators nervous? Where did that conviction come from? And could he possibly deserve to stand anywhere near it? Jackson set down his glass and picked up his phone. Dean answered on the first ring despite the hour. His lieutenant never slept deeply, always ready for the call that meant something had gone wrong, that violence needed managing, that the careful balance of power had shifted. "Find out where she'll be tomorrow," Jackson said. "Somewhere public, somewhere that isn't mine." "Boss, if you want me to arrange—" "No arrangement, just the location." Jackson's voice was firm. He didn't want Dean smoothing the path, creating circumstances that would force proximity. That would be another form of control, and he was beginning to understand that control was precisely what had failed him in the casino lounge. He ended the call and stared at the dossier photo clipped to the first page. Even in the flat professional headshot, clearly taken for some gallery event or consultant directory. Ariel's eyes held that same unwavering directness. She looked at the camera the way she'd looked at him. Present, aware, unbowed. He didn't realize this moment would come back to haunt him. Jackson Reed had built an empire on control, on taking what he wanted and crushing anything that stood in his way. He'd inherited his father's organization at 25 after the old man's heart finally gave out from decades of cigars and rage. In the 15 years since, he'd expanded that empire threefold: modernized operations, eliminated rivals, and established the kind of iron grip on the city that his father had only dreamed of achieving. He did it through intelligence, through calculated violence when necessary, through understanding that fear was more reliable than loyalty, and control was the only currency that mattered. But for the first time in his adult life, he was going to do something that terrified him more than any rival's threat. He was going to apologize. The library was glass and steel and natural light, nothing like the dark corners where Jackson conducted his usual business. He found Ariel on the second floor in the art history section, standing before a shelf with her head tilted slightly as she scanned titles. She wore charcoal slacks and a cream blouse, her hair pulled back in a low knot. Professional. Untouchable. Sunlight streamed through the massive windows, catching dust motes in the air and creating the kind of peaceful atmosphere that felt almost sacred. He should have walked away, but then he saw it. Jackson approached slowly, deliberately making sound on the hardwood floor so she'd hear him coming. The last thing he wanted was to startle her, to confirm every instinct she probably had that he was the kind of man who appeared uninvited in women's spaces. She turned, and for a fraction of a second, genuine surprise crossed her face before it hardened into guarded neutrality. He watched her assess the situation. Public location, morning hours, multiple witnesses, exit routes clear. She was running calculations, preparing defensive strategies. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Ms. Rose." He stopped 6 feet away, hands visible, posture open. Everything about his stance was designed to communicate non-aggression, though he suspected she was smart enough to know that a man like him was never truly without threat. "I owe you an apology." Her brows lifted slightly. She waited, giving him nothing, forcing him to fill the silence. It was a power move he recognized because he used it himself in negotiations. The person who speaks first reveals their position, shows their hand, demonstrates need. "The other night, I treated you with disregard," Jackson continued. "I assumed your time and attention were something I could purchase or demand. I was arrogant, and I was wrong. I'm sorry." Ariel studied him for a long moment, as if trying to detect the angle, the manipulation beneath the words. Her dark eyes searched his face, looking for the crack in the performance, the tell that would reveal this was just another strategy. "You came all the way here to say that?" "I did." "Why?" "Because you deserve to hear it." Jackson held her gaze, resisting every instinct to look away, to armor himself with the kind of cold distance that had served him for years. "And because I haven't been able to stop thinking about the fact that you were right to tell me to leave you alone." Her next words hit him harder than any bullet. Something shifted in her expression, a slight softening around her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the recognition that he was attempting something genuine, even if he was fumbling through it with all the grace of a man who'd forgotten how to be honest. Before she could respond, a man in an expensive suit materialized at her elbow, close enough to invade her space, smiling with practiced charm that didn't reach his eyes. "Ariel, what a coincidence," the man said, ignoring Jackson entirely in a way that suggested he had no idea who Jackson was. "I was hoping to catch you." "About the Morrison collection." Ariel took a small step back, her body language clearly communicating discomfort. "David, I'm in the middle of something." David's hand reached for her arm, presumptuous, entitled. He didn't make contact. Jackson moved with controlled precision, shifting his position so his frame blocked the man's reach, his presence suddenly filling the space with quiet, absolute authority. He didn't touch either of them, didn't raise his voice, just stood there with the weight of his attention focused on David like a blade. The temperature in the small space between the bookshelves seemed to drop 10 degrees. That moment, everything in the room changed. David's hand dropped. His smile faltered as his brain finally registered the danger standing before him. I'll call your office." He retreated quickly, nearly stumbling over his own feet in his haste to put distance between himself and whatever primitive part of his mind recognized Jackson as a predator. Ariel watched him go, then turned back to Jackson with something new in her eyes. Not gratitude exactly. Curiosity. She was reassessing, running new calculations based on this data point. "That was subtle," she said. "I didn't touch you," Jackson replied. "And I won't, unless you want me to." The promise hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. He was offering her something he rarely gave anyone. The guarantee that her boundaries would be respected, that her agency mattered more than his desires. Ariel's lips curved into the smallest hint of a smile. "Noted." She paused, then added, "Why did you really come here, Mr. Reed?" "Jackson," he corrected. "And I told you. To apologize." "That's the what?" she said. "I asked why." Jackson considered the question, forcing himself toward honesty even though every instinct screamed at him to deflect, to protect, to never show weakness. Because you're the first person in a very long time who's treated me like a human being instead of a transaction. You told me no, and you meant it. No calculation, no performance, just the truth. And He hesitated, searching for words. I didn't realize how much I needed that until you were brave enough to give it to me. Ariel studied him for another long moment, then reached for a book on the shelf beside her. I have to get back to work, Jackson. Of course. He started to turn away. But, she added, and he froze. If you're actually interested in being a human being instead of a transaction, you could start by telling me why someone like you needs my kind of honesty. If you're already rooting for someone who respects boundaries like Jackson just did, who can wield power without force, subscribe and join us. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Let's take this journey together and see if a man who controls everything can learn to surrender control for the right person. For 3 days, Ariel tried to forget Jackson Reed existed. She focused on client meetings, on catalog research, on anything that would crowd out the memory of a crime boss apologizing in a public library with what appeared to be genuine humility. She told herself that men like him didn't change, that the moment of restraint was performance, that getting involved would be the worst decision of her life. But her mind kept returning to the look in his eyes when he'd said he needed her honesty. It wasn't the look of a manipulator running a con. It was the look of someone who'd been starving and had just seen food for the first time in years. But what he discovered next changed everything. Then her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Jackson. Dean acquired this line so it's clean, untraceable to my business. I'm asking for one chance. Dinner, public restaurant of your choosing, to prove I can be the man you'd actually want to spend time with. If you say no, I won't contact you again. Ariel read it 4 times. She appreciated the directness, the acknowledgement of his world's dangers, the promise to respect her refusal. The text told her several things. He'd had someone acquire an untraceable phone line specifically to contact her, which meant he was serious about keeping her separate from his criminal enterprise. He was letting her choose the location, ceding control of their environment. And he was promising to disappear if she declined, giving her the power to end this before it began. She typed and deleted 3 responses before settling on the simplest. When? His reply came immediately. Whenever you're ready. She named a bistro downtown, neutral territory, popular enough that they'd never be alone, upscale enough that she'd feel comfortable, public enough that any violence would be impossible. Friday, 7. I'll be there. Something didn't add up, and the truth was darker than he expected. Friday arrived with Ariel changing outfits 3 times before settling on a simple black dress that felt like armor and elegance combined. She examined herself in the mirror, trying to understand what she was doing. Jackson Reed was dangerous. Not just metaphorically, actually, concretely dangerous. The kind of man who appeared in news reports when rival organizations went to war, whose name prosecutors whispered but could never quite build a case around. Getting involved with him was reckless at best, potentially life-threatening at worst. But there was something in his eyes that haunted her. A loneliness she recognized because she'd felt it herself. The isolation that came from being defined by what you did rather than who you were. From having people interact with your role instead of your humanity. She'd spent her career building walls, keeping clients at arm's length, protecting herself from the casual cruelty of wealthy collectors who treated her like a useful tool rather than a person. And then Jackson Reed had appeared in that library and basically said, I see you as a person, and I want to know if I can be one too. She arrived 5 minutes early and found Jackson already seated at a corner table, standing when he saw her approach. He wore a dark gray suit without the tie, the top button of his shirt undone, and he looked almost nervous. The last time she'd seen him, he'd radiated predatory confidence. Tonight he looked like a man stepping onto uncertain ground. You came. he said, as if he genuinely doubted she would. I'm intrigued, Ariel admitted, taking her seat. Confused, but intrigued. Jackson smiled. And it transformed his face from imposing to almost vulnerable. That's more than I expected. He gestured to the menu. Order anything. I mean it. Anything. I'm not trying to impress you with expense. I just want you to have what you want. They ordered wine, made small talk about the restaurant, the neighborhood, the surprising quality of the bread basket. Ariel found herself relaxing slightly, watching Jackson navigate ordinary conversation with the kind of careful attention most people reserved for high-stakes negotiations. He asked questions about her work, listened to her answers with genuine interest, and didn't interrupt or redirect the conversation back to himself. Then Jackson set down his glass and met her eyes. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know how to do this. Normal conversation, normal dating. I'm so used to people telling me what they think I want to hear that I've forgotten what genuine interaction feels like. Ariel appreciated the confession. Then let's establish rules. My rules. Please. She counted on her fingers. No possessive behavior. No violence. Not in my name. Not for my benefit. No monitoring my movements or vetting my friends. If this is going to work, you treat me like an equal, not a possession. Jackson absorbed each word like he was committing them to memory, understanding that this was the price of admission. Agreed. Can you actually do that? Ariel pressed. Can you turn off whatever instinct makes you control everything around you? For you? Jackson's voice dropped lower. I'm going to learn how. He paused, then added, I spent 15 years building an empire on control. Every decision, every relationship, every interaction governed by the principle that control equals safety. But sitting across from you right now, I'm realizing that control might also equal isolation. So yes, I'll learn. Because the alternative is walking away from the first real thing I've felt in longer than I can remember. His next decision would decide whether he lived or died. Ariel was about to respond when her phone lit up on the table. An unknown number. The message made her blood run cold. The boss's toy should know better. Jackson saw her face change. What is it? She turned the phone toward him. He read the message once, and something lethal flickered across his expression before he locked it down. When he looked up, his eyes were dark with fury he was visibly containing. She watched him fight for control. Watched him remember his promise about violence. Watched him choose a different path, even though every line of his body screamed for action. Victor Thorne, he said quietly. My rival just made you a target. And then, the gun clicked. The calls started the next morning. Ariel's phone rang at 6 a.m. with heavy breathing and a hang-up. At 9, someone left a voicemail of distorted laughter. By noon, she found her car in the gallery parking lot with a smashed passenger window and nothing stolen, just a note tucked under the wiper blade. Pretty things break so easily. He realized he wasn't alone. Someone else had arrived. Jackson arrived at her loft within an hour of her shaken phone call, flanked by Dean and 2 other men who looked like they could stop a freight train with their bare hands. He took one look at her face and his jaw tightened. Ariel saw the calculation in his eyes. He was running through scenarios, assessing threats, planning responses. The man from the restaurant had vanished, replaced by the crime boss who'd built an empire on calculated violence. Pack a bag, he said. You're staying at my penthouse until this is handled. Ariel wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could handle this herself, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her fear. She packed in silence while Jackson made calls in her living room, his voice low and controlled, but carrying the unmistakable edge of violence being carefully restrained. She heard fragments. Full security detail. Trace the calls. I want eyes on Victor's operation. And understood she'd stepped into a world with rules she didn't understand, and consequences she couldn't fully grasp. From here on, the rules of the game changed. The penthouse was all glass and steel and panoramic city views. 43rd floor, accessible only by private elevator, with security that would make a government building jealous. Dean swept the space for any possible security breach while Jackson guided Ariel to the main bedroom. "You'll be safe here," he said. "I have security on every floor, cameras on every entrance. No one gets in without my authorization." Ariel sat on the edge of the bed, processing the surreal shift her life had taken in less than 24 hours. Yesterday, she'd been an independent art consultant, living her carefully constructed life. Today, she was effectively a prisoner in a crime boss's fortress because his rival had decided to use her as leverage. Who is Victor Thorne? A rival with delusions of expansion. Jackson's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his expression went carefully blank. "Ariel, you should read this." He handed her the phone. The text was from the same unknown number that had sent the first threat. "Don't hide your true nature, Reed. Tell her who you are, or I will. Does your pretty art consultant know the Reed family runs half the organized crime on the East Coast? Does she know about the bodies, the extortion, the empires built on fear? Tell her, or I'll make sure she finds out in pieces." Hidden in the files was a secret that could destroy them all. Ariel read it twice, then looked up at Jackson. His face was stone, but his eyes held something raw. Fear that she'd see him clearly and choose to run. Fear that honesty would cost him the one genuine connection he'd found. She could see him preparing for rejection, armoring himself for the blow. "It's true," he said quietly. "All of it. I don't run a legitimate business empire. I run a criminal organization, powerful, feared, and built on exactly what that message says." He crossed to the window, unable to meet her eyes. "I was going to tell you, but I wanted more time. Wanted you to know me before you knew that." The silence stretched between them. Ariel's mind raced through everything she'd observed, the way people moved around him, the deference, the fear disguised as respect. It all made horrible sense. The casino wasn't just a business. It was a front. The polite negotiations were backed by implicit threats. The man who'd apologized in a library was also the man who'd built an empire on violence. "Say something," Jackson said, and for the first time, he sounded afraid. But there was one thing he didn't know about his closest ally. Ariel stood, crossed the space between them, and looked him directly in the eyes. "I'm not running," she said. "But if I'm staying, I'm not going to be your protected secret. I'm going to be your partner in ending this." Jackson's breath left him in a rush. "Ariel." "Tell me everything about Victor Thorne," she interrupted. "And then we're going to figure out how to stop him. Together. Not by hiding me away like some helpless damsel, but by actually solving the problem. You said you'd treat me like an equal. Prove it." Jackson stared at her like she'd just offered him something he'd never dared to want. "You understand what you're asking? To be involved in this world? To see things that can't be unseen? I understand that your rival made this my problem the moment he smashed my car window," Ariel said. "I understand that running away doesn't make me safe. It just makes me alone and vulnerable. And I understand that you need someone who won't lie to you about the hard things. So yes, I'm asking to be your partner. The question is whether you're brave enough to let me." Jackson told her everything. They sat at his dining table with coffee growing cold between them, and he laid out the architecture of his world with clinical precision. The Reed family's history, the territories they controlled, the uneasy truce with rivals like Victor Thorne that had held for 3 years until Jackson's interest in Ariel had apparently threatened Victor's sense of opportunity. Someone in the room was lying. But who? "He sees you as a weakness," Jackson explained. "A way to destabilize me, to make me act recklessly so he can justify a move against my territories. If I retaliate with violence, I break the truce and give him cover to escalate. If I do nothing, I look weak and other rivals start circling. It's a calculated provocation designed to put me in an impossible position. And will you? Ariel asked. Act recklessly? Jackson's smile was grim. That's exactly what he's counting on. The old me would have already put a dozen men on the street looking for blood. Would have sent a message so brutal that Victor would think twice about ever looking my direction again. He reached across the table, stopped just short of taking her hand. But you asked me to be different, so I'm going to be strategic instead. Ariel appreciated that he didn't touch her without permission, even now, even when fear and adrenaline probably made him want to grab onto something solid. She closed the distance, lacing her fingers through his. Then we need a plan. What do you know about Victor's operation? He's careful, Jackson admitted. Uses intermediaries, keeps his hands clean. Operates mostly in the financial sector. Money laundering, fraud, some cybercrime. Less messy than my world, which he considers more refined. If we're going to connect him to these threats, we need proof that will hold up even in my world's version of accountability. So we investigate, Ariel said. Properly. No violence, no intimidation. We find the evidence and we use it. He knew something that no one else in the building did. Dean entered with his phone in hand, expression dark. Boss, we've got a problem. Victor just reached out through back channels. He wants a meeting. When? Tomorrow night, neutral ground. Says it's about future collaboration. Dean's tone made it clear he thought it was a trap, a setup designed to draw Jackson into vulnerable territory. Jackson looked at Ariel. This could be an opportunity. If I can get him talking, see how he reacts, I might be able to confirm he's behind this. Maybe catch him making mistakes. Then I'm coming with you, Ariel said. Absolutely not. Yes, her voice was steel. If I'm your partner in everything. He already knows about me. Hiding me now just confirms I'm a weakness. But if I show up at your side, present and unafraid, what does that tell him? In that moment, the entire balance of power flipped. Jackson stared at her like he was seeing something he'd never encountered before. It tells him you're untouchable because you choose to be here, not because I'm forcing you to stay hidden. It tells him I'm not acting from a position of fear. He paused, running calculations. It's actually brilliant. If you're openly at my side, he loses the leverage of using you as a secret weakness. Exactly. Dean cleared his throat. For what it's worth, she's right. Strategically. Though I hate agreeing with a plan that puts a civilian in the same room as Victor Thorne. I'm not a civilian anymore, Ariel said quietly. Victor made sure of that when he targeted me. Jackson exhaled slowly. Fine. But we set ground rules, we have exit strategies, and you stay within arm's reach of me the entire time. At the first sign of trouble, Dean gets you out. Non-negotiable. The meeting took place in a private room at a high-end steakhouse, the kind of establishment that catered to power players and asked no questions. The room was elegant, dark mahogany panels, leather seating, soft lighting that suggested intimacy while allowing everyone to clearly see each other's faces. Victor Thorne was already seated when Jackson and Ariel arrived, flanked by two men who radiated barely contained violence. Victor himself was older, silver-haired, with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He wore an immaculate three-piece suit and the relaxed posture of someone who thought he held all the cards. But this wasn't even the most shocking part. Read, he said, standing to shake Jackson's hand. His gaze slid to Ariel with calculated interest, assessing her like a collector appraising a new acquisition. And this must be the lovely distraction I've been hearing about. Ariel rose, Jackson said, his hands settling possessively on the small of her back. My partner. Victor's eyebrow lifted. Partner? How modern. He gestured to the seats across from him. Please, sit. I took the liberty of ordering the wine. A 2015 Chateau Margaux. I thought we should celebrate potential collaboration. They sat. Ariel maintained perfect composure, meeting Victor's assessing gaze without flinching. She'd spent years navigating rooms full of wealthy collectors who viewed her as a useful servant, learning to project confidence even when she felt vulnerable. This was just another performance, except the stakes were considerably higher than losing a commission. Jackson kept his body angled slightly toward her, protective without being obvious. I appreciate you taking this meeting, Victor began, swirling his wine. I've been thinking about expansion opportunities, territories where collaboration might benefit us both. The financial district is becoming increasingly difficult to navigate alone, and I thought perhaps our organizations might find mutually beneficial arrangements. He trusted her, and that was his biggest mistake. Jackson played along, discussing percentages and districts with the ease of someone who'd negotiated 1,000 deals. But Ariel watched Victor's face, the micro-expressions that flickered when Jackson mentioned security concerns, the way his fingers tightened on his glass when Jackson referenced recent disruptions in communications. She'd learned to read people in her profession, to detect when a client was lying about their budget, when a seller was desperate, when someone was hiding damage or provenance issues. The skills translated surprisingly well to this darker arena. Victor was performing confidence, but underneath she detected something else. Uncertainty. He'd expected Jackson to arrive angry, destabilized, possibly alone. Instead, Jackson sat calm and collected with a woman who clearly wasn't frightened into hiding. Victor's plan, whatever it had been, wasn't unfolding as expected. Then Victor made his mistake. Of course, in this business, we all have to worry about our loved ones, he said, his eyes landing on Ariel again. So many dangers out there. Broken windows, threatening messages. A man has to protect what's his. What she found in the envelope froze her in place. The words hung in the air like a confession. Jackson's expression didn't change, but Ariel felt the tension coil through his frame like a spring being compressed. She placed her hand on his thigh under the table, a gentle pressure that said, "I'm here. Stay calm. Remember the plan." "Indeed," Jackson said softly. "Though I find the best protection is making sure everyone understands that certain lines, once crossed, have permanent consequences. I'm curious, Victor, have you heard of any such lines being crossed recently?" Victor's smile thinned. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Strange," Jackson continued, his voice conversational but edged with steel. "Because the disruptions I mentioned, the ones affecting my operations, they have a certain signature, the kind that suggests someone operating outside their usual territory, perhaps trying to send a message. Someone who thinks they're clever enough to provoke a response without getting caught. Dangerous assumptions to make without evidence," Victor said. "Oh, I never make assumptions without evidence," Jackson replied. "I just wanted to give you the opportunity to address any misunderstandings before they escalate into something nobody wants." The message was clear. Jackson knew, or strongly suspected, and he was offering Victor a chance to back down before this turned into open war. Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He hadn't expected Jackson to be this controlled, this strategic. He'd gambled on rage and gotten cold calculation instead. "Of course," Victor said after a beat too long. "I'm sure any misunderstandings can be resolved among reasonable men." The meeting ended 20 minutes later with handshakes and empty promises of future communication. In the car, Dean drove while Jackson and Ariel sat in the back seat, her hand tight in his. "He admitted it," Ariel said quietly. "As good as." "He confessed because he thinks I'm too distracted by you to retaliate effectively," Jackson replied. "He thinks he's already won." And suddenly, he realized he was being played. "Then we prove him wrong." Ariel turned to face him. But we do it my way. No blood, no war. We find proof, and we leverage it to make him disappear from our lives permanently. You promised me no violence in my name. I'm holding you to that. Jackson studied her face in the passing streetlights. You understand what you're asking me to do? To fight my nature, every instinct I have? My father would have had Victor in a warehouse within hours, would have sent pieces of him back to his organization as a warning. I'm not asking you to be your father, Ariel said. I'm asking you to be better than your nature. Can you do that? Jackson pulled her close, pressed his forehead to hers. For you, I'll become someone I don't even recognize. He paused, then added, but I need you to understand. If this doesn't work, if diplomacy fails, and he escalates, I will do what's necessary to keep you safe. I won't apologize for that. I'm not asking you to, Ariel said. I'm asking you to try the better way first. To prove to yourself that you're more than what you were raised to be. He didn't want revenge. He needed it. If you're on Jackson's side for choosing to be better, for fighting his nature to protect what matters, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. This story is just getting started. Dean worked around the clock for the next 72 hours. Jackson had given him explicit instructions. Find the connection between Victor and the threats, but do it cleanly. No intimidation, no violence. Just old-fashioned investigative work backed by the kind of technical resources that money could buy. Dean assembled a team of the best digital forensics experts money could buy. Some legitimate consultants, some hackers who owed favors, all of them motivated by either cash or fear to deliver results. This single decision gave him the upper hand again. Ariel watched Jackson pace his penthouse like a caged predator, every instinct screaming at him to act while his promise to her forced restraint. She brought him coffee, sat with him in silence when words seemed inadequate, and reminded him why they were doing this the hard way. She saw the struggle in his eyes, the man he was trying to become warring with the man he'd been trained to be. His father had taught him that problems were solved with violence, that mercy was weakness, that control meant crushing anyone who challenged you. Because you want to be someone I can build a life with, she said on the third night, finding him standing at the windows, staring out at the city he controlled. Not someone I have to fear. Jackson pulled her into his arms, buried his face in her hair. I've never wanted anything as much as I want that. His voice was rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. But I'm terrified I don't know how to be that person. That when it matters, I'll default to what I know. Violence, control, fear. Then we figure it out together, Ariel said. You're not alone in this anymore. For once, he wasn't thinking like a boss, but like a man about to lose everything. Dean's breakthrough came at dawn. He appeared in the penthouse with his laptop and exhaustion written across his face. Got him, he said simply, setting the computer on the dining table. They gathered around the dining table. Dean pulled up encrypted communications traced through multiple proxy servers, digital footprints that led directly to a number associated with Victor's head of security, a man named Marcus Webb. The evidence was comprehensive. Metadata from the threatening texts, security footage from the parking garage where Ariel's car had been vandalized, showing a vehicle registered to one of Victor's shell companies. Even voice analysis matching the distorted laughter in the voicemail to Webb's speech patterns. Webb sent the texts, made the calls, smashed the car window, Dean explained, walking them through each piece of evidence. But he was sloppy, left traces in his metadata. Confirmation receipts from the burner phone purchase that tied back to a credit card linked to Victor's organization. Victor probably thought using an intermediary would insulate him, create plausible deniability. It just gave us the evidence, Jackson said. He looked at Ariel. This is enough. We can use this to force Victor to back off permanently. but he had no idea a bigger force was controlling everything. How? Ariel asked. By showing him we have proof that would hold up even in legitimate court, which means his rivals would use it to tear him apart if it went public. Victor values his position above everything. Faced with exposure or retreat, he'll retreat. Jackson's mind was already running through the strategic implications. In our world, this kind of sloppy operational security is a death sentence. His own people would question his judgment, his rivals would smell blood in the water. Jackson made the call himself, putting it on speaker so Ariel could hear. Victor answered on the third ring, his voice cautious. Read. To what do I owe the pleasure? Marcus Webb, Jackson said simply. Burner phone purchased on the 14th, used to send threatening messages to Ariel Rose. Metadata traces, security footage, encrypted communications all pointing back to your organization. The silence on the other end was deafening. Everyone thought the deal went smoothly, but they were wrong. We both know what happens if this information reaches certain people, Jackson continued, his voice deadly calm. Your rivals would crucify you for sloppiness. Your own people would question your judgment. The Eastern European syndicate you've been courting would see you as a liability. Or, you can make this disappear. Call off Webb, issue a formal guarantee of non-interference through our mutual intermediary, and we never speak of this again. You have no proof, I ordered. I don't need proof of your direct involvement. Jackson interrupted. I just need proof your organization was involved. That's enough to destroy you. Your choice, Victor. Walk away clean, or face the consequences of sloppy operational security. You have 12 hours to decide. Another long silence. Then, Webb is terminated. You have my word there will be no further action. Not good enough. I want it in writing, through our mutual intermediary, with consequences for breach outlined explicitly. And I want Webb delivered to neutral ground so he understands personally that this is finished. Fine. Jackson ended the call. Ariel released a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. That's it? She asked. It's over? Not quite, Jackson said. I still need to handle Webb personally. Not with violence, he added quickly, seeing her expression. But he needs to understand that if he ever comes near you again, the consequences will be severe. And Victor needs to witness it to know the terms are being honored. What followed next was completely unexpected. The warehouse was neutral ground, equidistant from Reed and Thorn territories, empty except for the handful of people Jackson had specifically invited. The space was cavernous, industrial, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that cast stark shadows. Marcus Webb stood in the center of the concrete floor, hands zip-tied in front of him, flanked by two of Dean's most trusted men. Victor Thorne stood to the side, his expression carefully neutral, present as a witness to ensure the terms were honored. The temperature was cold enough that breath misted in the air. He had no idea the night would end in blood. Jackson entered with Ariel at his side. Webb's eyes widened when he saw her, confirmation flickering across his face before he locked it down. He'd expected Jackson to come alone, expected this to be the kind of meeting that ended badly for him. Ariel's presence confused the equation. Marcus Webb, Jackson said, his voice echoing in the empty space. You sent threatening messages to Ariel Rose. You damaged her property. You attempted to intimidate her into leaving my life. Webb said nothing, but his eyes darted to Victor, looking for support or instruction. Victor remained impassive. Jackson circled him slowly, predatory, and Ariel saw the man he'd been before meeting her. Cold, calculating, dangerous. Under normal circumstances, what you've done would have permanent consequences, the kind that end with shallow graves and missing persons reports. Everyone in this room knows that. Everyone in this city knows that crossing the Reed family means pain. His right-hand man had been hiding something from him. He stopped in front of Webb, close enough that the man had to look up to meet his eyes. But I made a promise to someone I care about that I would handle things differently. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave this city tonight. You're going to disappear so thoroughly that even thinking about returning will seem like suicide. In exchange, you get to keep breathing. Jackson's voice dropped to something lethal. But if you ever, and I mean ever, come near Ariel Rose again, if you so much as think her name too loud, the next conversation we have will be very different. Do you understand? Webb nodded frantically. Say it. I understand. I'm gone. You'll never see me again. Under the floorboard, he discovered a truth he wasn't ready for. Jackson turned to Victor. Your man. Your responsibility to ensure he honors this agreement. And Victor? This is the only warning you get. The truce holds because I'm choosing to let it hold. But if you come at me or mine again, I won't be so diplomatic. Clear? Victor's jaw tightened, but he nodded. It's handled. He paused. Then added, For what it's worth, I underestimated you. Most men in your position would have led with violence. I'm not most men, Jackson said quietly. Not anymore. Dean cut Webb's zip ties. The man fled the warehouse without looking back, practically running for the exit. Victor followed at a more measured pace, pausing only to say, You've changed, Reed. I'm not sure if that makes you more dangerous or less. Neither am I, Jackson replied honestly. When they were alone, Ariel stepped into Jackson's space, placed her hand on his chest where his heart hammered against his ribs. You kept your promise. It almost killed me, he admitted. His hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline and restrained violence making his whole body vibrate with tension. Every instinct I have was screaming to hurt him, to make an example, to show everyone what happens when someone threatens what's mine. But you didn't. You chose a different path. She stretched up, kissed him softly. You chose to be better. This was only the beginning of a much bigger war. Jackson wrapped his arms around her, held her like she was the only thing anchoring him to this new version of himself. Because of you, he whispered. All of this, because of you. You make me want to be someone worthy of standing beside you. They left the warehouse together, Jackson's arm around Ariel's shoulders, Dean following at a discreet distance. The night air was cold and clean, washing away the tension of the confrontation. As they drove back to the penthouse, Ariel watched Jackson's profile in the passing streetlights and saw something she hadn't seen before. Peace. Not complete, not permanent, but present. The look of a man who'd faced a test and passed it, who'd proven to himself that he could be more than what he'd been raised to be. 6 weeks later, Ariel woke in Jackson's penthouse with morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, and his arm draped across her waist. They'd fallen into a rhythm, her work schedule and his business somehow finding balance, her presence in his life transforming it in ways neither had anticipated. The loft in the arts district sat empty now, her belongings gradually migrating to the penthouse as the boundaries between their lives blurred and dissolved. She slipped out of bed carefully, pulled on one of his shirts, and padded to the kitchen to start coffee. The penthouse felt different now, less like a fortress, more like a home. She'd added touches of warmth, art prints on the walls, books on the shelves, plants that softened the hard edges of glass and steel. Jackson had watched her make these changes with something like wonder, as if the idea that his space could be lived in rather than just occupied was revelatory. Jackson found her there 10 minutes later, leaning against the counter with 2 mugs in hand. His hair was mussed from sleep. He wore only pajama pants, and he looked more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. Morning, he said, accepting the coffee and kissing her temple. Morning. Ariel studied his face, the way he'd softened around the edges, the tension that used to live in his shoulders now mostly absent. You look different. Different how? Lighter. She set down her mug, turned to face him fully. Like you're not carrying the weight of proving something anymore. But this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Jackson smiled. That's because I'm not. I spent my whole life taking what I wanted, controlling every variable, building power on fear and force. My father taught me that the only way to survive was to make everyone around you afraid to challenge you. That love was weakness, that trust was leverage to be exploited, that the only relationship that mattered was the one between predator and prey. He set his coffee down, took both her hands in his. And then you told me to leave you alone. Best decision I ever made, Ariel teased. Best thing that ever happened to me, Jackson corrected, his voice serious. That moment, that refusal, it broke something open. Made me realize that control isn't the same as connection. That real power isn't making people fear you, it's making yourself worthy of someone who has every reason to walk away, but chooses to stay. You chose to stay, Ariel. Even after you knew what I was, what I've done. You looked at the worst parts of me and said, I see you, and I'm staying anyway. Ariel felt her throat tighten. You know I love you, right? I know. He cupped her face in his hands. And I love you. Not because you bent to fit my world, but because you forced me to build a better one. You're not my possession, Ariel. You're my partner. Equal, essential, and absolutely safe because I will spend the rest of my life earning the trust you've given me. She kissed him, slow and deep, tasting coffee and promise and the future they were building together, Métis. When they finally pulled apart, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. I was thinking, he said. Maybe it's time I transition some of my business interests into legitimate operations. Slowly, carefully, but meaningfully. I've been talking to some consultants about creating legal business structures, finding exit strategies from the criminal side. It won't happen overnight, and I can't undo everything I've done, but I can build something different going forward. For us. For the life I want with you. Ariel's eyes widened. You're serious? I'm serious. I can't undo everything I've done, but I can build something different going forward. He hesitated, then continued. I also want to do something about the literacy program you volunteer with. Fund it properly, expand it. You talk about those kids sometimes, the ones who need someone to believe in them. I want to be part of that. I want to build something that helps instead of hurts. That's a massive undertaking. Both things. I know. Jackson smiled. Good thing I have a brilliant partner to help me figure it out. And I mean that, Ariel. Partner. I want you involved in every decision, every step. This isn't my redemption arc that you just witness. It's our future that we build together. Ariel laughed, pulled him close. Equal partners. Equal partners, he confirmed. In everything. He paused, then added more quietly. I met with a lawyer last week. Started the process of setting up trusts, legitimate business entities, succession plans that don't involve criminal enterprises. It's going to take years, maybe a decade, to fully transition out. But I'm committed to it. To becoming someone who can stand in the daylight next to you. You already are, Ariel said. The fact that you're trying, that you're choosing to change, that's everything. They stood in the morning light, the city sprawling below them, two people who'd found each other across an impossible divide and chosen to build a bridge instead of walking away. Jackson Reed had spent his life taking what he wanted through force and fear, building walls to protect himself from vulnerability, controlling everything and everyone to avoid the pain of genuine connection. But Ariel Rose had taught him something infinitely more valuable. That sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is leave someone alone until they choose to stay. That real strength isn't found in control, but in the courage to surrender it. That love isn't a weakness to be exploited, but a force strong enough to transform even the darkest corners of a human heart. Dean arrived an hour later with the morning briefing, found them cooking breakfast together in the kitchen, and smiled to himself. He'd worked for Jackson for 12 years, had seen him at his worst, had cleaned up messes that would give normal people nightmares. But he'd never seen his boss look happy. Not until Ariel Rose walked into that casino and refused to bend. "Boss," Dean said, accepting the coffee Ariel poured for him. "The lawyers sent over the preliminary structure for the transition plan, and Victor Thorne just announced he's retiring, moving his operations to the West Coast." "Good," Jackson said. "Let him be someone else's problem." "There's one more thing," Dean added, pulling out an envelope. "This came through secure channels this morning. It's from the Eastern European syndicate Victor was courting. They're interested in meeting with you. Legitimate business opportunities, apparently. Your reputation for keeping your word has spread." Jackson looked at Ariel, saw her nod of encouragement. "Set it up. But make it clear. I'm only interested in legitimate operations. The old business model is being phased out." After Dean left, Ariel turned to Jackson with a curious expression. "Does it scare you? Letting go of that world?" "Terrifies me," he admitted. "It's all I've ever known. My father built it, I expanded it, and now I'm dismantling it. Part of me keeps waiting for it to fall apart, for everything to collapse without the foundation of fear holding it together." But a bigger part of me is excited," Jackson said. "For the first time in my life, I'm excited about the future instead of just controlling it. I want to see what we build together. I want to find out who I can be when I'm not trying to be my father." Ariel kissed him again, softer this time. "I can't wait to meet that person." If this story touched your heart, please share in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that help sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. Your support keeps these stories alive.